obviously when you deadlift, the bar is in your hand. Because we have arms, you can think about the anchor point for the deadlift as being your shoulder blade. However, the muscles that are gonna produce all the force to move that bar are down here. They're gonna be your hips, your hamstrings, your quads, and then your back. So how do we get the force these muscles produce to come up through the shoulder blade and act on the bar? The answer there is bracing. You ever hear the saying, you can't fire a cannon from a canoe? It's a common analogy in regards to bracing while lifting. And I mean, just think about it. If you were to fire a cannon from the base of support a canoe provides, do you think the cannonball would actually go forwards? Or would you just end up propelling yourself, the canoe, and the cannon backwards? Basically, what I'm trying to say here is that if there's a lack of stability and rigidity in your trunk, when you go to deadlift, the force isn't gonna go where we want it to go, and it's not gonna do what we want it to do. Bracing is the act of creating that rigidity and stability so that we can produce and transfer force to where we want it. With all that being said, and the underpinning of why we might wanna brace, we're gonna get into the first of our 4 pillars of bracing, breathing. Breathing for bracing involves, first and foremost, learning how to properly execute the Valsalva maneuver. The Valsalva maneuver is when you create pressure in your trunk using air by forcibly trying to breathe out against a closed airway. This replicates what you may have felt before if you play a wind instrument, or sometimes if you're taking a really big, when I'm teaching the Valsalva maneuver to somebody who doesn't know it, I like to use the following exercise. All right, so here's the exercise. You can do the sitting, standing, whatever, just follow along with me. First, I want you to breathe all of your air out. More, all of your air. Okay, there. Now, can you feel how contracted your abdominal muscles are? And can you feel your obliques and your low back muscles? I want you to hold that contraction, then take a huge breath into that tightness, and then clamp your airway shut. There, you Valsalva'd. Now the Valsalva maneuver is the cornerstone of breathing for bracing because of a thing called IAP. Now IAP stands for intra-abdominal pressure. Now, the reason this is important is because our goal here is to turn your trunk into a cinder block while lifting. And if you're looking for rigidity in the trunk, there's nothing finer than air. Yes, air. Having that air pressure in there to actually displace space and to create that pressure against your core muscles is gonna allow them to be way more rigid and stiff than they otherwise could be on their own. Now, breathing for bracing in the deadlift really won't change between conventional and sumo very much. However, if you're a bigger or heavier lifter who pulls conventional, it's probably advantageous to get your air a little earlier in the setup, because once you've pulled yourself into tension and your torso's closer to the bar, your quads are gonna run into your torso and there's just gonna be a little bit less space to kind of inflate and take your breath. So keep that in mind. So what all that breathing is gonna look like is gonna depend on whether you're top down or bottom up setup. So myself, I bottom up setup, so I'll show you what that looks like first. In a conventional deadlift, you're going to wanna take your breath essentially as you find tension in your posterior, in your hips and hamstrings. So we'll come down, grab onto the bar, and then we pull in. So the breathing happens as we're finding posterior tension, we get the breath, we sit down the rest of the way. Sumo is gonna be very similar. Grip. We're finding that breath and taking our Valsalva as the hips come up behind you to kind of exaggerate and find that tension before pulling the hips down. In a top-down setup, it's gonna be slightly different because you're gonna be bracing and setting your trunk before you approach the bar. So the breathing will happen right at the very beginning. More like that. And sumo, again, pretty straightforward. Like so. And with all that out of the way, we're gonna get on to the second pillar of bracing, which is gonna be all about the core musculature. The first thing we need to understand when it comes to the core musculature in bracing for the deadlift is that we're talking about more than just the abs. Because we're trying to create an entirely rigid structure from all angles, we need to think about the abs, the obliques, and the low back extensors, as well as probably a whole bunch of muscles that I'm not gonna list because it would just overcomplicate things too much. Now, in terms of actually achieving that contraction, I mean, that kind of went hand in hand with the Valsalva thing. So if you go back and you do that exercise, that's probably the single best way to achieve a good contraction through all of these muscles. The only thing to note is that once you breathe into them, you wanna allow that contraction to sort of push outwards, right? You wanna think about expanding your brace in 360 degrees. One thing I want to make clear about bracing your core for the deadlift is that I don't want you to mistake extension for bracing. I think a lot of people have this idea that there shouldn't be any flexion, that any kind of back rounding is bad and evil and they're going to hurt themselves, and that's just not the case. If this is you and you're trying to brace by just extending your back a bunch, I want you to start thinking about pressure over positioning. A little bit of back flexion is totally fine, especially if it allows us to be a little bit more rigid and stiff in our positioning. Another thing that's really specific to core bracing for the deadlift is going to be the idea of being patient with your bracing. So I see a lot of people come down and they get set up, and then the first thing they do when they initiate the deadlift is this kind of reaching with the upper back. Again, it's that sort of extension, not real bracing. So if you're somebody whose first movement in the deadlift is to try to extend the back and drive the chest out, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're gonna make the deadlift harder than it should be. Try to be patient, right? Allow that core bracing to stay the same and just push with your legs. If you follow the rest of the steps in this video and you get everything locked in, that force will transfer and make its way through the shoulder blade to the bar. I promise. Now, if you're worried about injuries or whether or not your back is too rounded and flexion, extension, blah, 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 honestly, this video is already a doozy. That's a massive discussion. So I want you to just go check out the paper I've got linked in the description below, and that'll educate you. Our goal with bracing the core musculature for the deadlift is going to be to create a neutral range position, as well as to increase the rigidity of the trunk. We're less concerned about a perfect position and more concerned with creating something that is nice and tight and stiff and is going to be effective and safe for the individual. The bracing of the core for sumo versus conventional, top down versus bottom up, is all going to be the very same as our previous demonstration for breathing, because those things are going to happen at essentially the same time. The next pillar of bracing, however, is going to be the lats. When we talk about the importance of the lats in bracing, we need to think a little bit about the anatomy for a second. Now, the reason that I think the lats contribute a lot to our brace and deadlift is because they run specifically from the shoulder to this big sheath of tendon called the thoracolumbar aponeurosis. Say that 10 times fast. But basically, this sheath of tendon connects across your spine and down into your pelvis. So if we have a giant, strong muscle that connects your shoulder to your pelvis and back, hey, that really kind of falls in line with what we've been talking about, doesn't it? There's a lot of common cues that coaches and athletes use to try to get their lats active in the deadlift. And a couple of them are: pinch your armpits shut, pull the bar into your shins, put your shoulder blades in your front pockets, put your shoulder blades in your back pockets, and the anti-shrug. It's worth noting real quick here that when you're trying to use your lats in the deadlift as part of your brace, your grip width actually makes a little bit of a difference. I've found that lifters who grip really narrow can sometimes have a hard time feeling the lat incorporated in their brace. And for those lifters, a lot of times just moving your grip a finger or two wider can make a huge difference and kind of unlock the lats for you. If a lifter isn't incorporating their lats well into the deadlift, you can often identify it. And one of the most common things that we'll see is right as the bar comes off the floor, the shoulder blades roll forwards. It causes the lifter's hips to kick up behind them and they lose back position, the bar drifts away from them. All those things really coincide with a loss of tightness and a loss of the incorporation of the lats into the brace. Now in the conventional deadlift, you'll often see lifters have success with a little more sort of intentionally rounded upper back in terms of how they're taking their lat tension and using more of the cues of shoulder blades in the front pocket as you pull into tension. Whereas conversely, a sumo deadlift, you're gonna see lifters often try to get a little more upright, and in an effort to try to maximize their leverage against the bar, will get a little more retraction and maybe a little bit more sort of extension and chest up in terms of how they're cueing their lats to get tight. And that'll look a little more like this. Right, pulling down at the position, you can see I forced a little bit more extension in terms of how I was getting my lats tight there. Now in either case, we want to see some amount of shoulder blade or scapular depression, which is that downward movement. We don't necessarily want to see too much retraction. We want to bias the shoulder blades into pulling back when we're trying to contract our lats. We want to think a lot more about the shoulder blades moving down. In the bottom up setup, which is how I deadlift, the lats are kind of the final piece of the puzzle, and they're very much a linchpin for me to tie it all together and make sure my whole brace is solid. So when I'm pulling conventional, I'm gonna pull myself in. I'm usually gonna take my breath as I pull myself down. And the last thing I do, you'll be able to see, I pull my shoulder blades into position and start finding my brace and sort of finalizing my brace. When I pull sumo, it's gonna look very similar. And you can see I even kind of floated the bar there a little bit. But with the top-down setup, both sumo and conventional, you're essentially setting your torso before going down to approach the bar. And this will include your lats, right? We demonstrated this when we were talking about the bracing and the breathing. So essentially the top-down setup is gonna be setting some contraction here, breathing in, clamping the ribs down, clamping the lats down, and then as we go down to approach the bar, we're trying not to let any of the trunk or any of the torso move at least any further than we have to get our hands on the bar and get into a position to start the pull. The fourth pillar of bracing and the final pillar of bracing is gonna be belts. We'll talk about that next. Belts are a training tool that has been misunderstood by many for a long time. So we're just gonna clear some stuff up real quick. Number one, belts don't brace for you. You can't just add a belt and all of a sudden be tighter and braced harder. I mean, you can to an extent, but if you're not actively pushing out into and breathing into the belt, then you're not getting the benefit of it assisting in and providing another layer to this whole rigid system we've been working on creating. And the belt's purpose is really to increase that IAP that we talked about. So if you're not creating that pressure yourself, the belt's not going to reinforce it. Therefore, it's not going to help you as much as if you know what you're doing with it. Number two, the belt does not make your core weaker. For whatever reason, a lot of people seem to think that training with a belt will detrain your core, and that training without a belt will strengthen your core more so than using it. And ironically, there's more and more research coming out now saying the exact opposite. You can check the description for citation on that one. What I do recommend against, however, is your local sporting goods store's belt that's 2 inches tall in the front and 7 inches tall in the back with a weird taper and padding and cheap leather and a plastic clasp on it. Don't do that. Spend a little bit more money and get at least an entry-level powerlifting belt. You want something that's going to be 10 millimeters thick at least, and you want something that's going to be robust enough and a uniform height around your waist that you can push out against. If you don't have something rigid, then it's not going to assist you in creating that IAP and helping to reinforce your core musculature as you apply pressure outwards in that 360 degrees. Lastly, there are many lifters who choose to deadlift without a belt. Many phenomenally strong deadlifters specifically did not use belts. I've had clients that I've worked with where, for whatever reason, the trade-off in their ability to get into a good position isn't worth it. The additional pressure and bracing assistance from the belt might compromise their ability to get into a good position to an extent that they're not comfortable with. There are many reasons not to use a belt. If you choose not to, that's fine. It's not a universally necessary tool, but for most people, most of the time, you're gonna have a great benefit in addition to your brace if you're using a lifting belt. To recap, bracing in the deadlift is about creating a stiff and rigid torso so that we can transfer force from the lower body to the upper body. We do this using our breathing, our core musculature, our lats, and sometimes the lifting belt. If you like this video and you found it informative and helpful, make sure to leave a like, hit the subscribe button, and if you have any questions about anything we spoke about today, make sure to hit us up in the comments section below. Other than that, we'll see you in the next one. Peace.